My name is Elvire Debert, and I am an Impressionist painter. I paint with oils, usually landscape, flowers, still life, and children. I use the classic techniques of painter like Claude Monet and Auguste Renoir, who are my favorites. To me, painting is not only visual, it is an act of the soul. It is a means to express sensitivity to the subjects I portray. In the year 2000, I took a painting class at the College of Marin with Chester Arnold that had a dramatic effect on my life. Chester was an inspiring teacher, and he was a mentor to me.
At that time, I gave my students an assignment to look back at the 20th century and explore the ideas that lingered in them of experiences in that 20th century that evoked passion, that evoked sadness, or that it just evoked reflection of any kind.
After the class, I thought about World War II, the Holocaust, and back to my ancestors who lived in Spain in the 15th century. For over 1,000 years, Jews were a persecuted minority throughout Europe and frequently subject to violence and banishment from one region to another. In 1492, the Spanish government forced its large Jewish community to either convert to Christianity or be expelled. When conversos were suspected of practicing Judaism in secret, they were burned alive in terrifying public spectacles. My family fled to Morocco in North Africa, and I was born 400 years later in Casablanca in 1931. I had a happy childhood. I knew there was war in Europe, but I really was unaware of the atrocities that were taking place. The year I was born, just 2 years after Anne Frank, who lived in Holland, the Nazi Party came to power in Germany at a time when millions were unemployed and people were desperate. The Nazis were able to convince the Germans that they were a master race destined to rule the world, and all their troubles were blamed on the Jews. Soon Jews were banned from public schools. They couldn't marry non-Jews or work as teachers, lawyers, doctors, or journalists. In 1938, when I was 7, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, occurred in Germany. Jewish windows were smashed, their businesses were looted, synagogues were burnt, and thousands of men were taken to concentration camps. Soon, even little children were forced to wear yellow stars to identify them as Jews. These terrible events, however, were only the beginning of what the Nazis called the final solution. As World War II engulfed Europe, they began a systematic campaign to completely eliminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth. Living in Morocco, the war was not far away. There were Nazi cells in Casablanca, and anti-Semitism was rising around us. If the war had lasted longer, I shudder to think what might have happened. After the war, I finished high school and college and moved to America, where I got married. Soon I had 2 daughters who grew up to bless me with 5 grandchildren. One day in my 40s, I walked into an artist's studio and began taking painting lessons. My first painting was a copy. Of course, I had to copy something. It was a copy of Fantin-Latour, A Bouquet of Chrysanthemums. When my husband first saw it, he really couldn't believe it was mine. "You have never painted in your life?" he said. And everybody said, "No, it's hers. It's really hers." Later, Jean became my biggest supporter and always gave me encouragement.
Elvira came in and she was already painting beautiful, charming, soft-edged, joy-of-life paintings, I would characterize them as. But there was no darkness or introspection, at least of dark topics, in her work at all at that point.
After Chester's assignment, I went to the library and was able to get many books about the Holocaust. I didn't know too much about it. At the beginning, I couldn't comprehend what was happening. It was, I started studying more and more and more. I studied, and the more I wanted to know. I was consumed by the enormity of the Nazis' crimes. It unraveled feelings of anger, pain, and compassion. I felt an increasing obligation to honor those who perished, and I wanted to keep their memory alive. One day I started drawing. I wanted to present the story of how this murderous event occurred. Finally, I came up with 9 pictures that I turned into paintings.
She had tapped into a very deep well of feeling for herself. You could almost feel the compassion pressing out. A painting of something that's maybe has a horrifying history, or the representation of a horrifying history, is very different than the horrifying history itself. It is history that has been transformed by a thinker, a viewer, a painter, into something that is constructive. And as a result, it allows us to examine our own feelings about something.
Later, I added poems to the painting to give them additional dimension. Then they were donated to the Florida Holocaust Museum, where they became part of their permanent collection. A few years after, they were published in a book called Realm of Silence. At first, I struggled with how to depict these events in a mere painting. I began with a typical Impressionist view of a peaceful village representing life before the Nazis came to power. But in the air above, storm clouds are gathering and smoke is turning the air black. Anguish-laden clouds obscure the sky of former days. The unknown approaches. By 1940, throughout Europe, entire Jewish communities were uprooted from their homes and driven into overcrowded walled ghettos where hunger, disease, and terror reigned. In Warsaw alone, 470,000 were forced into barely 1 square mile. Soon, mass deportations began to concentration camps. In Warsaw, the last 20,000 staged an uprising that fought off the German army for a full month. Finally, the Nazis torched the entire ghetto to smoke out the heroic resistance. SS burned house after house. A sea of suffocating smoke laps the city. The struggle is heroic and tragic. I only wanted a hint of color in these paintings. Muted, monochromatic, because this was a way to evoke loss and despair. The people are faceless in the painting because they have lost their identity. They have lost their home, their belongings, and their occupation. So they went, not knowing their destination, desperately trying to keep their loved ones near, and realizing they could be killed at any moment. Forced to wear the yellow star, barred from all profession, land and houses confiscated, bewildered bodies carry all they have left. By 1942, when I was 11, thousands of Jews were being herded into sealed railway cattle cars. They barely had room to stand, with only a tiny opening for air. Many died of thirst and starvation. When Anne Frank's family was discovered in 1944, they ended up in a cattle car much like these. Days and nights to an unknown destination. Thirst and starvation, stench of death, suffocating heat, freezing torment. Auschwitz, the most infamous of all the camps. Trains came to a halt, bolted doors were open, and suddenly the sound of barking dogs and screaming soldiers. Families were torn apart. 2 columns were formed. Those fit to work were kept alive, underfed and brutalized. Children, the old and the weak were murdered in gas chamber right away. In the painting there is snow on the ground, but I didn't want it on the roof to heighten the sense of darkness, anguish, and anxiety. Tattooed with numbers, beaten and starved, murdered. Triple electrified barbed wire fences ensured that no one could leave these camps. It was freezing cold and there was no escape. I avoided violent and graphic images because I don't like violence and I wanted not to disturb children when they look at it. And it was important to me to give them the message, but not in a violent way. Nature is beautiful, but it is oblivious to human pain. In the bleakness of winter, grieving caged souls cannot escape. The final solution was well planned. Before gassing people, they collected and sorted their belongings. The Allies found mountains of shoes in Auschwitz. In one pile, over 40,000. Each one tells a story. A baby's tiny booties, a young woman's with pretty lace, the boots of a hard-working father. Volcano of screaming shoes made of dead leather, torn cloth, the flesh, the souls that filled them, children, brides, tailors, old women, poets. Each shoe belonged to somebody that was murdered. Today there is silence, but who can look at this room without hearing the cries? They were expecting a shower, but instead the pellets of Zyklon B filled the room with suffocating gas. In the door was a peephole, so a soldier could be sure he filled the room with enough of the murderous poison. The innocent stand naked. The taps hiss Zyklon B gas. Who looked through the peephole to see how fast they died? At the end of the war, the victorious Allied armies were shocked to discover hundreds of concentration camps throughout Europe. The killing had gone on day and night for years. It was beyond comprehension. While over 1 million prisoners were freed, thousands were so weak they never survived at all. In the Jewish tradition, we light candles on the anniversary of a loved one's passing. This is how we honor the dead and keep them alive in our hearts. shine forever. From the ashes of extinction, we illuminate the soul, pass on the light to future generations. The victims are not here to talk about their suffering and what they went through, so it takes painters, sculptors, poets to talk about it. It has to be remembered in the hope that it won't recur again.